Louisa May employs two concepts of human goodness in hospital sketches: virtue on the one hand and duty on the other hand. We want to learn the difference between these two concepts of human goodness. It's a common assumption that it's the good person who attains the good life. So we want to look closely at what are two different visions of what a good person is. First, let's talk about virtue, something we're familiar with. Virtues are clearly known to Louisa May Alcott. In Transcendental Wild Oats, she refers to theological virtues like hope in her mother. In Hospital Sketches, in Chapter 1, Louisa May shows herself deliberating with her family and planning out the steps to become a U.S. Army nurse. That's a demonstration of prudence. In Chapter 5, prudence is referred to or named explicitly. Louisa May has to quarantine, and her supervisor says, "Let's be prudent. You need to stop, nursing and quarantine and rest until you get to be better." Another virtue that shows up in Hospital Sketches, perhaps the most important virtue in this story, is courage. She uses the term bravery or fortitude. Courage is the good habit of enduring dangers and advancing despite dangers. This virtue is important because Louisa May, as a woman, um, is going to encounters odd characters and uncertainties in the public world. This is evident in Chapter 1 when she's attempting to locate free ticket passes to take the railroad. She needs courage to find the tickets. And Louisa May in Chapter 3 asserts that both the nurses and the patients required courage to be in the hospital. For the nurses, courage was needed to withstand sort of horrible sights of amputations and wounds, and the patients, on their part, needed courage to withstand surgery from the doctors. So courage is an important virtue, and she mentions on page 60 finally that courage was something brought out of her and the others in this hospital experience. In general, Louisa May Alcott is a person who admires character in people. Character is a rough translation of virtue. In Chapter 2 especially, Louisa May people watches, and she describes the good characters around her and also the bad characters. For example, she describes a British couple, and she admires the husband who's very obedient, observant of his wife. On the other hand, Louisa May describes people who are negligent, who don't do their jobs or aren't engaging enough to her. Virtue shows up in Chapter 4 when Louisa May describes the Virginia blacksmith, a man who's about to die, and Louisa May is given the task of telling him he's about to die, and she describes him with the glowing terms of the virtues. He is courageous, pious, dignified, temperate. All these character traits are evident to Louisa May in a man who's lying in a hospital bed about to die. That's very impressive. In general, the three of the four cardinal virtues are referred to by Louisa May: prudence, courage, and temperance. And two theological virtues are referred to in Hospital Sketches, or these virtues are described: hope on the one hand and faith on the other. Okay, now let's talk about what is called a duty. Louisa May uses the term duty throughout Hospital Sketches, also to talk about human goodness. There's evidence in Transcendental Wild Oats that this is an important concept for her. For example, on page 372, she refers to her mother, who was willing to perform the small duties at the farm, whereas the men were called away to pursue the great duties, like reforming uh, New England, ending slavery, pursuing vegetarianism. Back to Hospital Sketches, the term duty arises on page 1 in the very first sentences of Hospital Sketches. Louisa May says, or writes, "I want something to do." This remark being addressed to the world in general, no one in particular felt it their duty to reply. The term duty occurs in all of the chapters, and I want to read to you perhaps the most important statement on page 21, which is chapter 3. The sight of several stretchers, each with its legless, armless, or desperately wounded occupant, entering my ward, admonished me that I was there to work, not to wonder or weep. So I corked up my feelings and returned to the path of duty, which was rather a hard road to travel just then. It's worth noting that the term duty is, in the 19th century and in the 20th century, is associated with the job of being a nurse. Duty is a sort of a catch-all phrase for the obligations and importance of a nurse's work. From Louisa May's statements about duty, we can infer several features of any duty. A duty is something that involves a specific action that anyone ought to do in a particular situation. And moreover, a duty is something that we have to recognize in that given situation. And Louisa May frequently points out that people fail to recognize what their duty is. And finally, Louisa May mentions in the quote I've just read on page 21 that in following the path of duty, she has to cork up her feelings. So for her, being a dutiful person involves, putting aside your wishes, putting aside your emotions, and doing the task which you're obliged to do. Well, Louisa May has the right idea about what a duty is. In the 18th century, there was a famous Prussian philosopher. Prussia, or this area of Prussia, is now part of Russia. And his name was Immanuel Kant, and he made the concept of duty a central part of his ethics, or theory of human goodness. And according to Immanuel Kant, a duty is any non-negotiable basic action which anyone in that situation would recognize as obligatory. And like Louisa May Alcott, whose father very likely read Immanuel Kant in the 19th century, a duty is something that we do without regard for our own interests, without regard for our emotions or feelings, and importantly, even without regard for consequences. So let me give you some examples of duties, of dutiful actions. This will greatly help your understanding. My favorite example of a duty is the following. When you see, if you or I see somebody in need of help, they're in danger, it's our duty to rescue them. It's non-negotiable when we see somebody in danger. Similarly, if there's an emergency and I'm not competent to do anything about the emergency, then it's my duty to report the emergency to authorities. It's non-negotiable, something that has to be done without regard to my fears or aversions. This is an example of a duty from Immanuel Kant. We have a duty to speak the truth when somebody asks for the truth. It may be, painful to myself. It may be, the consequences of speaking the truth may be harmful to me, but we always ought to speak the truth. In short, duties are some specific action which it is non-negotiable to avoid. It has to be done in order to be a good person. Louisa May Alcott talks about human goodness both in terms of virtues and in terms of duties. So she sees a compatibility between these two concepts. However, in philosophy today, many philosophers emphasize the antagonism between virtues and duties. Let me give you a hint of the antagonism. A virtue, we've learned, is a habit, and it's a firm and lasting habit. And when I have a virtue, I bring this virtue from situation to situation. I carry this good habit with me. And even more importantly, when I have a virtue, the activity which it empowers, I do with pleasure. I do successfully. I can do such an action with ease. So, for example, a person with prudence enjoys deliberating and is successful deliberating. That's not at all what a duty is like. A duty is always a specific action, and according to Louisa May Alcott and Immanuel Kant, I need to recognize in the situation what my duty is. It's like an act of the mind or the conscience to identify what a duty is. Sometimes authorities help identify what our duty is in a given situation. And importantly, when I act according to duty, I don't act according to my feelings. I don't act with regard to the consequences. I simply do the action because it is my duty to do that action. It's evident that as Louisa May first arrives at the hospital, she is overwhelmed with her tasks and feels all kinds of anxiety, and so she tells us she assumes the path of duty. She's just going to do what actions are obligatory. However, as she becomes acclimated, as her talents can come out and she forms relationships, she tells us now that she enjoys nursing, that it is a labor of love. So it seems that as Louisa May becomes acclimated, she can now exercise her good habits or virtues, and the path of duty is no longer required. I want to mention that there are two titles for these competing theories of human goodness. Virtue ethics is the theory of human goodness, organizing and describing human goodness with the virtues. By contrast, deontology is the theory of human goodness, organizing and describing human goodness with the duties. We will continue to talk about duties when we come to Pope St. John, and of course the virtues will continue to be an important way of describing human goodness in Philosophy 225.